The September sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty platform of Cedar Falls Station, making the air shimmer like water over the packed dirt. Lenora May Hartley stood with her back pressed against the rough wooden wall of the depot, her worn carpet bag clutched in both hands. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, watching the hem of her gray traveling dress collect the red dust that seemed to coat everything in this forsaken corner of Missouri. "Train's coming," her brother Samuel announced, his voice carrying neither warmth nor regret. He stood a careful distance away, as if her shame might be contagious. Their father hadn't even come to see her off, said he'd already wasted enough time on a daughter who'd thrown away her virtue and the family's good name. The whistle's lonely wail echoed across the prairie, and Lenora finally raised her eyes. The black locomotive appeared through the heat haze, belching smoke into the cloudless sky. Other travelers on the platform shifted with anticipation, gathering their belongings and children. But around Lenora, there remained a circle of empty space, as if the townsfolk could smell the scandal on her. "You remember what you're to do," Samuel said, pulling a folded envelope from his vest pocket. "This here's the agreement. Man's name is Garrett McKenna. Got himself a cattle spread up in Montana territory. He's expecting a wife, not—" He paused, his jaw working as he searched for words that wouldn't scald his tongue. "Not damaged goods, so you keep your mouth shut about what happened here." Lenora took the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was the brief correspondence, her family's carefully worded advertisement that made no mention of her condition, and the terse response from a widower seeking a helpmate for his remote ranch. No photographs had been exchanged, no sweet words of courtship. Just a business transaction to rid one family of its shame and provide another with necessary labor. "I understand," she whispered, though understanding and accepting were vastly different things. 6 months ago, she'd believed James when he promised to marry her, believed him right up until she told him about the baby, and he disappeared like morning mist, leaving her to face her father's rage alone. The train groaned to a stop, steam hissing from its wheels. The conductor stepped down, calling out destinations in a voice roughened by coal dust and distance. "All aboard for Kansas City, Cheyenne, and points west." Samuel grabbed her elbow, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "You bring any more shame on this family, and there won't be a place for you anywhere. You understand me, Lenora May?" She nodded, blinking back tears that would only be seen as manipulation. The baby was gone now. Her mother had seen to that with the help of a woman who knew about such things. The physical pain had faded, but the hollow ache in her chest remained, a constant reminder of her fall from grace. "Get on, then," Samuel said, releasing her arm and stepping back. Lenora climbed the steep steps into the passenger car, her legs shaking beneath her petticoats. The car was already half full, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. She found an empty bench near the back and settled onto the hard wooden seat, placing her carpetbag on her lap like a shield. Through the smudged window, she watched Samuel turn and walk away without a backward glance. No wave, no lingering look of regret, just the back of his brown coat disappearing into the crowd. She was truly alone now, cast out like a biblical sinner, heading toward a future as uncertain as the vast territories that lay ahead. The train lurched forward, and Cedar Falls began to slide away. First the station, then the familiar streets where she'd walk to church every Sunday in her white gloves and best bonnet. The steeple of First Presbyterian disappeared last, that holy spire where she'd once sung in the choir and dreamed of her wedding day. The journey to Montana territory took 8 days. 8 days of bone-jarring travel through an increasingly wild landscape. The comfortable farms of Missouri gave way to the endless grasslands of Kansas, then the dusty cattle towns of Wyoming. At each stop, Lenora watched the world grow rougher, the people harder. By the time they reached the mountains, she felt as if she'd traveled not just across a continent, but into another age entirely. In Billings, she had to switch from the train to a stagecoach for the final leg of the journey. The coach was a battered Concord, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. Her fellow passengers were 2 miners heading for the copper camps and a salesman with a case full of patent medicines. They eyed her traveling dress and soft hands with knowing looks, but said nothing. A woman traveling alone to the frontier was either running from something or running to something, and neither option invited casual conversation. The stagecoach road was little more than a pair of ruts carved into the earth. They climbed into hills covered with lodgepole pines, then descended into valleys where streams ran clear and cold. The September air grew thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine resin and something else, a wildness that made her chest tight with equal parts fear and strange exhilaration. On the afternoon of the second day out of Billings, the driver called out, "Stillwater Creek, end of the line for the lady." Lenora's heart hammered against her corset stays as the coach rolled to a stop in front of a building that could barely be called a town. There was a general store with warped siding, a blacksmith shop, and a saloon from which tinny piano music drifted. That was all. Beyond these few structures, the mountains rose in waves of green and gray, their peaks already dusted with early snow. She climbed down from the coach, her legs stiff and aching. The driver handed down her carpetbag and trunk, tipped his hat, and climbed back to his seat. Within moments, the stage was rolling away in a cloud of dust, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the wide dirt street. The sun was sliding toward the western peaks, painting the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Lenora looked around, searching for someone who might be Garrett McKenna. A few men lounged outside the saloon, but their interested stares made her look away quickly. A woman emerged from the general store, took one look at Lenora's traveling costume, and hurried past with her lips pursed in disapproval. Minutes stretched like hours. The mountain wind cut through her dress, and she pulled her shawl tighter. Perhaps he'd changed his mind. Perhaps he'd taken one look at her from some hidden vantage point and decided she wasn't worth the trouble. The thought brought both disappointment and strange relief. Then she heard it, the steady clop of hooves on packed earth. A lone rider emerged from the tree line, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who belonged to this wild place. As he drew closer, Lenora could make out details: a tall frame in the saddle, broad shoulders beneath a worn duster, a hat pulled low against the setting sun. He reined in his horse, a sturdy bay gelding, and dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than on foot. When he pushed back his hat, Lenora got her first clear look at Garrett McKenna. He was perhaps 35, with the weathered complexion of someone who lived beneath the open sky. His face was all angles, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw shadowed with several days' growth of beard. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. They were the gray of winter storms, holding depths of something that might have been sorrow or might have been simple weariness. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her dusty dress, her pale face, the way she clutched her carpetbag like a lifeline. Something shifted in his expression, not quite softness, but a gentling of the hard lines around his mouth. "Miss Hartley," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was low, roughened by wind and silence. "Mr. McKenna," she managed, proud that her voice didn't shake. He nodded once, then moved to collect her trunk. He hefted it easily, securing it behind his saddle with practiced movements. Then he turned back to her, and for the first time, their eyes truly met. "Come with me," he said quietly, extending one calloused hand. Those 3 words, spoken without judgment or false warmth, nearly undid her. After weeks of harsh voices and harder looks, the simple invitation felt like absolution she didn't deserve. She placed her hand in his. Let him help her onto the horse. He swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. They rode in silence as the last light faded from the sky. The trail wound upward through stands of aspen and pine, following a creek that gurgled and sang in the gathering darkness. Lenora had never been on horseback like this, pressed against a stranger's chest, feeling the solid warmth of him through the layers of cloth between them. She should have been frightened. Instead, she felt oddly protected, as if the mountains themselves had claimed her. By the time they reached his homestead, stars were beginning to pierce the darkening sky. The cabin materialized from the shadows. A sturdy structure of chinked logs with a stone chimney from which smoke drifted. It looked solid, permanent, like it had grown from the earth itself. Garrett helped her down, his hands gentle but impersonal on her waist. While he tended to the horse, she stood in the yard, breathing air so clear it made her lungs ache. The silence was profound. No church bells, no neighbors' gossip, no accusing whispers. Just the wind in the pines and the distant howl of something wild. When Garrett emerged from the small barn, he found her still standing there, looking lost. He paused, and she sensed him choosing his words carefully. "It's not much," he said finally, gesturing toward the cabin. "But it's warm and dry. You'll have your own room." Relief flooded through her. She'd been prepared for immediate demands, for a man who'd see her as property bought and paid for. This unexpected consideration threatened the fragile control she'd maintained throughout the long journey. Inside, the cabin was spare but clean. The main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with supplies. A bearskin rug covered the plank floor. Through one door, she glimpsed a kitchen with a wood-burning stove. 2 other doors led to what must be bedrooms. Garrett lit an oil lamp, the warm light pushing back the shadows. In that glow, she noticed things she'd missed outside. The fine lines around his eyes, the careful way he moved, as if he'd learned not to disturb the silence more than necessary. He showed her to her room, small but private, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and hooks on the wall for clothing. Someone had once tried to make it welcoming. Faded calico curtains hung at the single window, and a quilt that must have taken months to piece together covered the bed. "Was this?" She stopped, unsure how to ask about the woman who'd come before. "Yes," he said simply. "Then, I'll let you get settled. There's stew keeping warm on the stove when you're ready." He closed the door softly behind him, leaving her alone. Lenora sank onto the bed, running her fingers over the wedding ring pattern of the quilt. Through the thin walls, she could hear him moving about, the ordinary sounds of a man in his home. No anger, no demands, just patient presence. She unpacked slowly, hanging her few dresses on the hooks, placing her mother's Bible on the small shelf by the bed, the one thing from home she'd been allowed to keep. When she finally ventured out to the kitchen, she found Garrett sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, staring into the fire. He looked up when she entered but didn't speak, just gestured to the pot on the stove. She served herself, the simple venison stew tasting better than anything she'd eaten in weeks. They ate in silence. But it wasn't the condemning silence of her family's table. This was something else, a quiet that asked nothing of her, that didn't demand confession or explanation. When she finished, she rose to clear the dishes, but he stopped her with a slight gesture. "Tomorrow," he said. "Rest tonight." She returned to her room, changed into her nightgown, and slipped beneath the quilt. Through the window, stars crowded the sky in numbers she'd never imagined. The wind sang through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, that wild creature howled again. For the first time since that terrible morning when she'd told James about the baby, Lenora allowed herself to cry, not the bitter tears of shame or the desperate sobs of loss, but something quieter, a release of the breath she'd been holding for so very long. She was here now, at the edge of the world, with a man who asked nothing of her but her presence. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. She would have to learn this new life, prove herself useful, navigate the complex territory of being wife to a stranger. But tonight, in this small room with its faded curtains and hand-stitched quilt, she was simply Lenora, not the ruined daughter or the shameful secret, but a woman beginning again in a place where the past might finally be allowed to rest. The mountains stood guard in the darkness, ancient and indifferent to human sorrow, and in their shadow, 2 damaged souls slept under the same roof, separated by thin walls and thick griefs, not yet knowing that salvation sometimes comes not through forgiveness from others, but through the simple act of continuing on. The first week passed in a blur of small disasters. Lenora woke each morning to the foreign symphony of mountain sounds, the creek's constant murmur, the whisper of wind through pine boughs, the harsh cries of birds she couldn't name. The altitude made her breathless, and the physical demands of frontier life quickly revealed how soft her town upbringing had left her. The wood-burning stove fought her at every turn. Back home, their kitchen girl had managed such things. Here, Lenora struggled to maintain the proper temperature, burning the biscuits one morning and serving them half raw the next. Garrett ate whatever she placed before him without complaint, but she caught him glancing longingly at the bacon he'd been frying for himself before her arrival. Water had to be hauled from the creek in heavy buckets that left her arms aching and her hands blistered despite her gloves. The first time she tried to carry 2 buckets at once, she stumbled on the rocky path and sent water cascading over her skirts. She sat there in the mud, soaked and furious with herself, until the sound of approaching footsteps made her scramble to her feet. Garrett appeared through the trees, leading his horse back from wherever he'd spent the morning. He took in her bedraggled state, the muddy dress, the empty buckets, the tears she couldn't quite hide, and dismounted without a word. He filled both buckets and carried them to the cabin, then returned to find her still standing by the creek, wringing out her skirts. "There's a flatter path," he said quietly, pointing to a barely visible trail through the brush. "Easier footing." That was all. No criticism. No exasperated sighs like she'd grown accustomed to at home. Just practical information delivered in that low, steady voice. She watched him lead his horse to the barn, wondering at this man who seemed to exist in a sphere of perpetual calm. The cabin itself told its own story. Every surface bore the marks of a woman's touch, embroidered flour sack towels in the kitchen, doilies protecting the surface of a small side table, pressed flowers framed and hung by the window. But dust had settled over these feminine touches like a shroud. In the corner of the main room sat a rocking chair with a half-finished piece of knitting still resting on the seat, as if the maker had just stepped away and might return at any moment. Lenora didn't dare disturb these artifacts. She cleaned around them, careful as an archaeologist preserving relics of a lost civilization. Once, while dusting, she discovered a photograph tucked behind the framed flowers. It showed a young woman with dark hair and a sweet, round face, wearing what was clearly a wedding dress. The woman's eyes held a gentle happiness that made Lenora's chest tight with something between envy and grief. She quickly replaced the photograph, but the image stayed with her. This was who Garrett truly wanted. This soft-eyed girl who could embroider flowers and knit by the fire. Not a fallen woman who couldn't even manage to cook beans without scorching the bottom of the pot. Garrett's routine rarely varied. He rose before dawn, started the fire, and disappeared outside to tend the small herd of cattle he kept in the pastures below the cabin. He'd return at midday for a brief meal, then vanish again until dusk. After supper, he'd sit by the fire cleaning his rifle or mending tack, the lamplight casting harsh shadows across his weathered features. They might have continued this way indefinitely. 2 strangers sharing a roof but little else, if not for the day Lenora fell. She'd grown more confident after 2 weeks, even proud of small victories like successfully baking bread and patching a hole in Garrett's work shirt. The morning was crisp with the promise of coming winter, and she'd volunteered to gather kindling from the woodpile behind the barn. The wood was stacked higher than her head, and she had to stretch to reach the smaller pieces on top. She was balanced on her toes, arms full of kindling, when her foot slipped on a patch of frost-slicked ground. She fell hard, the wood scattering as her ankle twisted beneath her. The pain was immediate and sharp. She tried to stand but gasped as fire shot up her leg. Crawling was her only option, but the cabin seemed impossibly far away. The morning sun climbed higher as she sat in the dirt, fighting tears of frustration and pain. She didn't hear Garrett approach. He moved through his domain with the silence of a hunting cat. Suddenly he was there, dropping to one knee beside her, his face creased with concern. "What happened?" His hands were already moving over her ankle, gentle despite their calluses. "I slipped," she managed through gritted teeth. "I'm sorry. I was trying to—" "Hush!" The word was soft but firm. He probed her ankle carefully, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out. "Not broken, just twisted." Before she could protest, he slipped one arm beneath her knees and another around her back, lifting her as easily as if she weighed nothing. Her face flamed with embarrassment. No man had held her this way, not even James in their most intimate moments. "I can walk," she lied. He gave her a look that suggested he knew better but didn't dignify the claim with a response. Instead, he carried her into the cabin and settled her in the chair by the fire. His movements were efficient as he removed her boot and stocking, seemingly unbothered by the impropriety of touching her bare skin. He wrapped her ankle with strips of clean cloth, then propped it on a wooden crate. Throughout his ministrations, Lenora found herself studying his face, the concentration that drew his brows together, the careful way he avoided causing her additional pain. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, and their eyes met. The moment stretched between them, filled with something indefinable. His gray eyes held hers, and she saw something shift in their depths, a flicker of warmth, perhaps, or recognition of shared vulnerability. Then he blinked and stood, the moment shattered. "Rest," he said. "I'll see to supper tonight." She spent the afternoon in the chair, her ankle throbbing but her mind spinning faster. She'd glimpsed something beneath Garrett's stoic exterior, a capacity for tenderness that he kept carefully hidden. It made her wonder what had driven him to build these walls. What pain had taught him to move through the world so quietly? When evening came, he served her a simple meal of fried trout and cornbread. To her surprise, he brought his own plate to sit near her by the fire rather than at the table. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping me, for—" She gestured helplessly, encompassing everything, his patience with her failures, his quiet acceptance of her presence, his refusal to demand explanations she couldn't give. He studied his plate for a long moment. "My Mary," he said finally, the name falling between them like a stone into still water. "She came here from Boston. Thought she knew what she was getting into, marrying a rancher, but the mountains—" He shook his head. "The mountains don't care where you come from or what you know. They'll teach you or break you, one way or the other." It was the longest speech she'd heard from him. Lenora sensed the gift in it, this sharing of something personal, this acknowledgement that she wasn't the only one who'd struggled here. "What happened to her?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. His face closed slightly, but he answered, "Childbirth. The baby came too early, and the nearest doctor was 2 days away." He set down his barely touched plate. "That was 3 years ago." 3 years, the dust on the doilies, the unfinished knitting, the photographs left where she'd placed them, all of it preserved like a shrine. Lenora felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy or might have been pity. To be loved so steadfastly that your ghost lingered in every corner, what must that be like? "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded once, then stood abruptly. "I'll bank the fire. You should rest that ankle." But he paused at the doorway to his room, looking back at her. "You're doing fine," he said quietly. "The mountains, they take time to understand. Be patient with yourself." After he'd gone, Lenora sat in the firelight, her ankle forgotten as she pondered this strange new life. She'd expected hardship, the physical demands, the isolation, the awkwardness of living with a stranger, but she hadn't expected this, the quiet kindness, the unspoken grief, the way the mountains seemed to hold them both in a suspension of time and possibility. That night, she lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind test the walls. Through the thin partition, she could hear Garrett moving restlessly, the creak of his bed as he turned and turned again. 2 souls under one roof, each nursing wounds that wouldn't heal, each careful not to disturb the other's pain. But something had shifted today, in his gentle handling of her injury, in the sharing of his wife's name, in that long look by the fire. Something had begun that neither of them could name. Not healing. Not yet. But perhaps the first, tentative recognition that they were not alone in their suffering. The mountains stood eternal in the darkness, patient as stone. And in their shadow, two broken people began the slow work of learning to exist in the same space, not as mail-order bride and desperate widower, but as human beings marked by loss and trying, carefully, to continue on. The blizzard arrived without warning on a late October morning. Lenora woke to an eerie silence, the creek's constant babble muffled, the usual bird songs absent. Through her window, she saw nothing but a wall of white where the mountains should have been. Garrett was already up, moving with quiet urgency as he brought in armload after armload of firewood, stacking it high against the wall inside. His face was grim as he checked the shutters and secured the barn door with extra rope. "How long?" Lenora asked, pulling her shawl tighter as cold air gusted through the briefly opened door. 3 days, maybe 4. He paused in his preparations to look at her. "You've not weathered a mountain storm before." It wasn't a question, but she shook her head anyway. Back in Missouri, winter meant frost on window panes and perhaps a few inches of snow. This wall of white fury bearing down on them was something else entirely. By midday, the storm had engulfed them. Wind howled like a living thing, throwing snow against the walls with such force it sounded like handfuls of sand. The temperature plummeted until frost formed on the inside of the windows, and even standing near the roaring fire couldn't completely chase away the chill. They were trapped, the two of them, in a world reduced to 4 walls and a circle of firelight. The careful distance they'd maintained for the past month collapsed under the weight of enforced proximity. There was nowhere to retreat, no outside tasks to escape to, just the two of them and the storm's endless rage. Lenora busied herself with small tasks, mending, cleaning, anything to keep her hands occupied. But by the second day, she'd run out of busy work. She found herself studying Garrett as he sat by the fire, carving something from a piece of pine. The lamplight caught the planes of his face, softening the harsh lines, making him look younger despite the silver threading through his dark hair. "What are you making?" she asked, desperate to fill the silence that pressed against them as relentlessly as the storm. He held up the piece, a horse beginning to emerge from the wood. "Just passing time. My father taught me. Said idle hands were the devil's workshop." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Though I reckon the devil himself wouldn't venture out in this weather." It was the closest thing to humor she'd heard from him. Emboldened, she pulled her chair closer to watch him work. His hands moved with surprising delicacy, coaxing the shape from the wood with patient strokes of his knife. "Could you teach me?" The question surprised them both. He looked up, studying her face in the firelight. Then he reached for another piece of wood and a smaller knife. "Here, start with something simple. Feel the grain first. Wood wants to split along its natural lines." Their hands brushed as he showed her how to hold the knife, and Lenora felt a jolt of something electric pass between them. If he noticed. He gave no sign, just continued his patient instruction. But she saw the slight tremor in his fingers as he pulled away. The storm raged on. They worked in companionable silence, wood shavings curling at their feet. When darkness fell, though it was hard to tell day from night in the blizzard's grip, they prepared a simple supper together. The domesticity of it struck Lenora. Standing side by side at the stove, their movements coordinated without words. Like a dance they were slowly learning. That evening, she noticed him favoring his left shoulder, rolling it occasionally with a grimace. "Old injury?" she asked. "Horse threw me last winter, landed on a rock." He shrugged, then winced. "Axe up when the weather turns." Without thinking, she moved behind his chair. "My mother used to get aches. She taught me." She hesitated, hands hovering near his shoulders. "May I?" He went very still, and she thought he would refuse. Then he nodded once, tension radiating from every line of his body. She placed her hands on his shoulders, feeling the knots of muscle through his shirt. Slowly, carefully, she began to work at the tension, using the techniques her mother had shown her. He was rigid at first, unaccustomed to being touched. But gradually, incrementally, she felt him relax under her ministrations. "There," she said softly, stepping back. Better. He rolled his shoulder experimentally, surprise flickering across his face. Yes, thank you. Their eyes met and held. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song. But inside, in this small circle of warmth and light, something else stirred. An awareness, a possibility, a recognition of need that had nothing to do with convenience or obligation. Garrett cleared his throat and stood abruptly. I should check the firewood supply. But he paused at the entrance to the lean-to where the wood was stacked. Without turning, he said quietly. Mary used to do that, when my shoulder troubled me. A long pause. It's been a long time since anyone... He didn't finish, just disappeared into the lean-to. Lenora understood. It had been a long time since anyone had touched him with kindness, just as it had been a long time since anyone had looked at her without judgment or disgust. The third night of the storm, they sat by the fire sharing the last of the coffee, rationing it carefully. The conversation came easier now, flowing in fits and starts like spring melt. Why Montana? Lenora asked. You don't sound like you were born to this. Virginia, originally, but after the war, he stared into his cup. Came west in '67, thought I could outrun things, memories, found out they travel light, don't need supplies or a wagon to follow you. She understood that too, the futility of trying to leave the past behind. It clung like smoke to your clothes, seeped into your skin until it became part of you. Is that why you answered the advertisement? To not be alone with them anymore? He considered this. Maybe, or maybe I was just tired of the quiet. Get so you start talking to the cattle, just to hear a voice. He glanced at her. What about you? Why agree to come to a place like this? The truth pressed against her teeth, begging to be spoken, but fear held her back. Instead, she said, I had no choice. My family, they needed me gone. Must have been bad, he said quietly. Whatever it was. Tears stung her eyes, the gentleness in his voice, the lack of pressing for details. It undid her careful composure. Yes, she whispered. It was bad. The sob came from somewhere deep, surprising them both. Suddenly she was crying, really crying, for the first time since arriving. Not the quiet tears she'd shed in private, but wrenching sobs that shook her whole frame. Garrett moved without hesitation. One moment she was alone in her chair. The next, he was kneeling beside her, gathering her against him. She pressed her face into his shoulder, breathing in the scents of wood smoke and pine, letting years of held-back grief pour out. He said nothing, just held her steady against the storm of her own emotions. One hand stroked her hair with an awkward tenderness, the gesture unpracticed but sincere. When the sobs finally quieted to hiccups, she pulled back, mortified. I'm sorry, Don't. His voice was rough. Don't apologize for feeling things. She looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes. His face was inches from hers, close enough to see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes, the small scar above his left eyebrow. Something shifted in the air between them, charged like the moment before lightning strikes. His hand came up slowly, so slowly, to rest against her cheek. His thumb brushed away a lingering tear, the touch feather-light but searing. She leaned into his palm without meaning to, starved for gentleness after so many months of harsh words and harder looks. Lenora, he said, her name a question and a prayer. But then the wind gusted hard enough to rattle the windows, breaking the spell. He pulled back, his hand dropping away. The loss of his touch felt like another grief. You should rest, he said, standing. Storm might break tomorrow. She nodded, not trusting her voice. But at the door to her room, she turned back. He still stood by the fire, shoulders bowed as if carrying a great weight. Garrett? He looked up. Thank you for letting me... We all got things that need letting out, he said simply. No shame in it. That night, sleep wouldn't come. She lay listening to the storm's fury, but beneath it, she was aware of him in the next room, aware in a way she hadn't been before. When she'd pressed against him, she'd felt his heart beating, quick and strong. Had felt him trembling too, fighting his own battle with long-suppressed needs. Near dawn, the wind finally began to ease. She rose and peered out the window to see stars appearing between racing clouds. The storm was breaking at last, but inside the cabin, another storm was just beginning, one made of loneliness and longing, of two damaged people discovering that perhaps they didn't have to weather their griefs alone. When morning came properly, they'd have to dig out, tend the stock, return to the careful dance of daily life. But something fundamental had changed in those 3 days of enforced closeness. The walls between them had cracked, letting in possibilities neither had dared imagine. Garrett was already up when she emerged, standing at the window watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered peaks pink and gold. He turned at her approach, and their eyes met across the room. No words were needed. They both understood that the landscape had shifted, internal geography rearranged by the storm's passing. Outside, the world lay transformed under its blanket of white. Inside, two people stood on the edge of their own transformation, frightened and hopeful in equal measure, no longer quite so alone. Spring arrived like a miracle after the long, brutal winter. The snow retreated up the mountainsides, revealing grass so green it hurt to look at. Wildflowers pushed through the damp earth, Indian paintbrush, lupine, and tiny alpine forget-me-nots that carpeted the meadows in purple and blue. With the warming weather came a new rhythm to their days. Garrett taught Lenora the skills she needed to truly belong to this land. She learned to shoot his Winchester, her shoulder bruising from the recoil until she got the stance right. He showed her how to read the sky for weather, how to spot fresh bear sign, how to whistle the particular way that brought his horse trotting over. "Never know when you might need to defend yourself," he said, adjusting her grip on the rifle, "or put down an animal that's suffering." His hand covered hers on the stock, steady and warm. Since the blizzard, these small touches came more frequently, a hand at her elbow to steady her over rough ground, fingers brushing as they passed tools between them. Each contact sent sparks through her, and she could see in his careful stillness that he felt it too. They worked together to repair winter's damage, patching the roof where snow had worked through, mending fences, preparing the garden plot. Lenora discovered she had a talent for coaxing life from the soil. The seeds she planted flourished under her care, and Garrett would sometimes catch her humming as she worked among the young plants, dirt under her nails and sun bringing out the copper in her hair. "You look content," he observed one afternoon, finding her thinning carrots. She sat back on her heels, considering. "I am," she said, surprised by the truth of it. "I never thought, back home, I felt like I was suffocating. Here, I can breathe." He nodded as if this made perfect sense. Mountains do that. Strip away what doesn't matter, leave you with what does. As the days grew longer and warmer, they began taking evening walks after supper. At first, they stayed close to the cabin, but gradually their rambles extended farther into the surrounding wilderness. Garrett knew every trail, every stream, every hidden meadow. He shared them with her like gifts, showing her the beaver dam in the lower creek, the eagle's nest high in a dead pine, the place where morels grew after rain. One evening in late May, he led her along a deer track she'd never noticed before. It wound upward through aspens whose leaves whispered secrets in the breeze. Just when her legs began to protest the climb, the trees opened onto a sight that stole her breath. A hidden canyon lay before them, its walls painted in layers of red and gold by the setting sun. At the bottom, a waterfall tumbled into a pool so clear she could see trout finning in its depths. Columbines nodded along the banks, their star-shaped blooms like scattered coins. "Oh," she breathed. Inadequate, but all she could manage. "Found it my first year here," Garrett said quietly. "Never showed anyone else. Not even—" He stopped. But she knew. Not even Mary. The significance of this wasn't lost on her. He'd brought her to his secret place, shared something that had been his alone. She turned to thank him and found him watching her with an expression that made her pulse race. "You're different now," he said, "than when you first came. Stronger. So are you," she replied. "You smile sometimes now." He did smile then, a real one that transformed his weathered face. Hadn't noticed I'd stopped. They stood there as the sun sank lower, painting their faces gold. The air between them hummed with possibility. Lenora felt herself swaying toward him, pulled by a force as natural as gravity. His hand came up to touch her face, fingers trembling slightly. "Lenora," he said, and her name had never sounded like that before, like a revelation, like coming home. But a crack of thunder split the air, making them both jump. Storm clouds had built while they weren't watching, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. "We need to go," Garrett said, though he didn't immediately move. Lightning flickered across the darkening sky. "Now." They ran as the skies opened, rain soaking them within seconds. The trail turned treacherous with mud, and Lenora slipped. Garrett caught her, pulling her against him to steady her. For a moment they stood pressed together, rain streaming down their faces, both breathing hard for more than the run. "Come on," he said roughly, taking her hand. They made it back just as full darkness fell, bursting through the door soaked to the skin and laughing, actually laughing, at the absurdity of it. Lenora couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like this, wild and free. "You're drenched," Garrett said unnecessarily, water dripping from his own hat brim. "So are you." She was shivering now, the mountain evening cold despite the season. He built up the fire while she retreated to change into dry clothes. When she emerged, he'd laid out towels by the hearth and was stoking the flames higher. He'd changed too, his hair still damp and curling slightly at his collar. She sat by the fire, toweling her hair dry. He sat nearby, the familiar silence settling between them, but charged now with everything unspoken. The thunder rolled outside, and rain drummed on the roof. "Thank you," she said softly, "for showing me your place." He looked at her then, firelight dancing in his eyes. "It's your place too now." The simple statement undid something in her chest. Your place too. After months of feeling like she belonged nowhere, unwanted and cast out, these 3 words offered what she'd thought lost forever. A home. She must have made some sound, because suddenly he was beside her, concern creasing his brow. "What is it?" How could she explain? "No one's wanted me around in so long. My family couldn't wait to be rid of me. And I thought coming here, I thought I'd just be trading one place I wasn't wanted for another. But you..." She met his eyes. "You make me feel like I could belong here." His jaw worked as he struggled with words. "Finally," he said. "That first day, when I picked you up at Stillwater Creek, you looked so lost, so young and scared, and I thought, what right do I have to bring someone else into this hard life? But then," he reached out, tucking a damp strand of hair behind her ear. "Then you started bringing the place back to life. The garden growing, curtains clean, bread baking. Hadn't realized how gray everything had gotten until you brought color back." His hand lingered against her cheek. Lenora turned her face into his palm, pressing her lips against the calluses there. She felt him shudder, heard his sharp intake of breath. "I dream about you," he confessed roughly. "Wake up reaching for you. Keep thinking I should apologize. But I can't make myself sorry for it." "Don't be sorry," she whispered. "I dream too." Lightning flashed, illuminating his face for an instant. Raw hunger mixed with tenderness, desire tempered by restraint. Then darkness again. Just the 2 of them in the dancing firelight, balanced on the edge of something irreversible. "I don't want to scare you," he said, echoing words from their past. Lenora took his face in her hands, feeling the roughness of his day-old beard, the warmth of his skin. "I'm not afraid," she said, repeating her own words from before. This time, she meant them completely. He made a sound low in his throat. Then his mouth was on hers. The kiss was nothing like the fumbling attempts she'd known before. This was fire and tenderness combined, passion held in careful check. His hands tangled in her damp hair as she pressed closer, tasting rain and coffee and something essentially him. When they broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily. He rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed. "Lenora," he said again, her name a prayer of thanks on his lips. "I know," she said, because she did. She understood the war inside him, loyalty to a ghost versus the demands of the living, the safety of solitude versus the risk of loving again. He pulled back to look at her, and she saw her own feelings reflected in his storm-gray eyes. Wonder at this unexpected gift, terror at the possibility of loss, hope, fragile as spring shoots, but just as determined to grow. "Stay with me," he said simply. "Not tonight, not for now, but always." She heard it in his voice. "Yes," she answered, meaning it with every fiber of her being. They sat by the fire as the storm spent itself outside, hands linked, learning the shape of this new thing between them. When the rain finally stopped, stars appeared between scattering clouds. But inside the cabin, another kind of clarity had emerged. Two people who'd thought themselves beyond redemption, discovering that perhaps grace could find you even in the wilderness, even when you'd stopped looking for it. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There were still secrets between them, still griefs not fully spoken. But tonight, in this moment suspended between storm and starlight, they had this, the crackle of fire, the warmth of clasped hands, and the dawning certainty that neither of them was alone anymore. The change in their relationship transformed the cabin into something new, a true home rather than merely shelter. Mornings began with shy smiles over coffee. Evenings ended with gentle kisses by firelight. They moved around each other with a new awareness, hands touching whenever they passed, eyes meeting across rooms with unspoken promises. Lenora bloomed under Garrett's quiet affection. She attacked her daily tasks with renewed energy, humming as she worked, her step light despite the hard labor. The garden flourished under her care, neat rows of vegetables promising abundance come harvest. She'd even convinced some wildflowers to grow near the porch, their bright faces greeting visitors like a welcome sign. Garrett, for his part, began to shed the armor of his grief. He spoke more easily now, sharing stories of his childhood in Virginia, his experiences in the war, his early days homesteading. Sometimes Lenora would catch him simply watching her as she worked, a soft expression replacing his habitual sternness. One warm June morning, Garrett announced they needed supplies from town. "Thought you might like to come along," he said, trying to sound casual. "Pick out some fabric. Maybe those curtains are getting threadbare." Lenora understood what he was really offering, a public acknowledgement of her place in his life, in a frontier community. Appearing together in town was as good as an announcement. She wore her best dress, a blue calico that brought out her eyes, and pinned her hair up properly for the first time in weeks. When she emerged from her room, Garrett stood transfixed. "You look—" He cleared his throat. "You look fine." The ride to Stillwater Creek took 3 hours through country, now lush with summer growth. They talked easily, pointing out hawks circling overhead, deer grazing in distant meadows, but as the buildings came into view, Lenora felt her stomach tighten. The last time she'd stood on that dusty street, she'd been a discarded woman with nowhere to go. Now she returned as, what, not quite a wife, despite the understanding between them. The ambiguity of her position suddenly loomed large. Garrett must have sensed her tension. He reached over and covered her hand with his. "Hold your head up," he said quietly. "You've got nothing to be ashamed of." The general store was busy with Saturday shoppers. Conversation stuttered to a halt as they entered, all eyes turning to assess Garrett McKenna's mail-order bride. Lenora felt the weight of their scrutiny, the calculations behind their stares. "Mrs. McKenna," the shopkeeper's wife said with cool politeness that stopped just short of rudeness. "How nice to see you in town." Lenora didn't correct the assumption about her name, just nodded and began examining bolts of fabric with what she hoped looked like calm interest behind her. She could hear whispers starting up like grass fires. "Heard she came from back east. Some kind of scandal?" Poor Mr. McKenna, after losing Mary. Her hands trembled as she fingered a length of yellow gingham. These people would never accept her, would always see her as the fallen woman who'd somehow tricked their way into a good man's home. This one, Garrett said firmly, appearing at her elbow. He'd selected a bolt of deep green fabric that would indeed make handsome curtains. And enough of that blue for a new dress. Garrett, that's too much. My wife needs a new dress, he said, loudly enough for the whispers to hear. The word wife rang through the store like a bell. Heat flooded Lenora's cheeks, but she kept her chin up as he'd instructed. Let them whisper. Garrett had claimed her publicly, and that was worth more than their approval. They were loading their purchases when a woman approached, middle-aged, with a kind face lined by sun and hardship. Mrs. McKenna, I'm Sarah Hutchins. My husband and I have the ranch north of yours. She lowered her voice. Don't mind the biddies. Half of them have their own secrets buried deep. You're good for Garrett. Anyone can see it. He hasn't looked this alive in years. The unexpected kindness nearly undid Lenora's composure. Thank you, she managed. You'll come for Sunday dinner sometime, Sarah said firmly. I'll send word. As they rode home, Lenora treasured this small victory. One friend, one ally. It was a start. But their newfound happiness faced a sterner test when they encountered Reverend Josiah Mills on the road just outside town. The stern-faced minister reined in his horse, blocking their path. Mr. McKenna, he said, ignoring Lenora entirely. A word, if you please. Reverend, Garrett acknowledged, his voice carefully neutral. I've heard disturbing talk in town about your domestic arrangements. The minister's eyes flicked to Lenora with distaste. As a Christian man and a member of this community, you must know that living in sin— Careful, Garrett interrupted, his voice gone dangerously quiet. Choose your next words real careful. Reverend. I'm only thinking of your immortal soul and your standing in the community. If you insist on keeping this woman, then at least make it proper in the eyes of God and man. Though I must say, a man of your character could do better than— Then what? Garrett's hand had moved to rest on his rifle. Then the woman who brought life back to my home, who works beside me every day without complaint, who makes me remember what it's like to want to wake up in the morning. The Reverend's face flushed. I've heard about her past, the shame that follows her from Missouri. You'd tie yourself to that. Bring that into our God-fearing community. What I bring into my home is my business. Garrett said, and if your God is too small to forgive whatever sins you think she's committed, then I reckon he's too small for Montana anyway. Mr. McKenna, such blasphemy! We're done here. Garrett clicked to his horse, and they moved around the sputtering minister. But a few yards down the road, he called back. And Reverend, if I hear you've been spreading poison about my wife, you and I will have more than words. They rode in tense silence until the minister was out of sight. Then Garrett pulled up, his hands tight on the reins. I'm sorry, Lenora said miserably. I'm causing you trouble, just like I knew I would. Maybe I should. Don't. He turned to face her fully. Don't you dare finish that thought. But he's right. I am ruined. I did bring shame, and now you— He reached out and caught her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. Listen to me. I don't care what you did or didn't do before you came here. All I know is that you've given me back something I thought was dead forever. You think I give a damn what Mills or anyone else thinks? They can all go to hell. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You called me your wife. His fierce expression softened. Seemed simpler than explaining, unless— He hesitated. Unless you minded. I didn't mind, she whispered. They made it home as afternoon shadows grew long. While Garrett tended the horses, Lenora started supper, her mind churning over the day's events. The Reverend's words had awakened all her old fears. How long before someone ferreted out the specific details of her shame? How long before Garrett learned about the baby? She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear him come in until his arms circled her from behind. She leaned back against his solid warmth. letting it anchor her. "Stop fretting," he murmured against her hair. "I can feel you thinking too hard. I don't want to bring you grief." He turned her to face him, his eyes serious. "The only grief would be losing you. Understand?" She searched his face, finding only sincerity. "I don't deserve you." "That's where you're wrong." He cupped her face in his hands. "We deserve each other. Two broken people who found a way to make something whole." That night, they sat outside watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The confrontation with the Reverend had shaken something loose between them, made their connection both more public and more precious. "I love you," Lenora said suddenly, the words escaping before she could call them back. Garrett went still beside her. For a terrible moment, she thought she'd ruined everything. Then he pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair. "Say it again," he demanded roughly. "I love you. Garrett McKenna." He kissed her then, deep and desperate, as if trying to merge their souls through touch alone. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he said. "God help me. I thought I'd forgotten how. But I love you, Lenora." Later, as they prepared for bed, still in separate rooms despite the growing intensity between them, Lenora paused at her door. "Garrett, what you said to the Reverend about making things proper." He looked at her steadily. "Whenever you're ready, if you want to." She smiled, heart full to bursting. "I want to." His answering smile transformed his face. "Then we will, soon as you like." That night, Lenora lay wakeful but peaceful. Outside her window, an owl called across the darkness. The sound no longer seemed lonely, but rather like a celebration. One creature calling to another across the vast night, proclaiming that here, in this moment, no one was alone. The weight of her unspoken truth grew heavier with each passing day. As July blazed into August, Lenora found herself starting confessions a dozen times, only to swallow the words when she saw the contentment in Garrett's eyes. How could she shatter this fragile happiness they'd built? But secrets, like seeds, have a way of pushing toward the light. It started with a letter. Garrett had gone to town alone for supplies. Returning with a grim expression and an envelope he handed her wordlessly. The return address made her blood run cold. Cedar Falls, Missouri. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Her mother's careful script filled the page. "Lenora May, your father has taken ill. The doctor gives him weeks, perhaps days. He has not asked for you, but I thought you should know. Your brother Samuel says to tell you not to come. It would only upset him in his final hours. I pray you have found some measure of peace in your new life. Mother." The letter fluttered from her numb fingers. Garrett retrieved it, scanning the contents quickly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Do you want to go?" "They don't want me there." The words came out flat, emotionless. "I'm already dead to them." That night, the nightmares returned, twisted dreams of babies crying in the dark, of her father's face twisted with disgust, of blood and pain and a tiny form she'd never been allowed to hold. She woke, gasping, pillow damp with tears. "Lenora?" Garrett stood in her doorway, silhouetted by moonlight. "I heard you cry out. Just a dream," she managed, but her voice broke on the words. He crossed to her bed, sitting carefully on the edge. "Tell me," and suddenly, she couldn't hold it back anymore. The words poured out in a torrent. James's promises, the discovered pregnancy, her father's rage. She spoke of the woman with knowing hands who'd come in the night, of the agony that followed, of the tiny life lost before it could begin. "They made me," she sobbed. "They held me down and made me, and afterwards they looked at me like I was nothing, like I was already gone. And maybe they were right. Maybe I am nothing." Garrett hadn't moved throughout her confession, hadn't even seemed to breathe. Now, in the darkness, she waited for him to stand, to leave, to look at her with the same disgust she'd seen in every face back home. Instead, he gathered her into his arms, pulling her against his chest. "You're not nothing," he said fiercely. You hear me? You're not nothing. I killed my baby. She whispered into his shirt. No. His voice was rough with emotion. They killed your baby. They took your choice away, just like they took everything else. He pulled back to look at her face in the moonlight. Is that why you agreed to come here? To get away from them? She nodded miserably. I thought I could start over. Pretend it never happened. But I see that baby in my dreams. Garrett, I see what might have been, and Shh. He stroked her hair, rocking her gently. I know about ghosts, remember? About carrying what might have been. They stayed like that until dawn began to gray the windows, sharing the weight of grief. When Lenora finally stopped crying, wrung out and empty, Garrett spoke again. This doesn't change anything, not how I feel, not what we have. How can you say that, knowing what you survived, he corrected firmly. That's all I need to know. You survived something terrible, and you're here now, and that's what matters. But the peace couldn't last. 2 days later, Reverend Mills appeared at their door, and he wasn't alone. 3 men from town accompanied him, their faces set in lines of righteous determination. Mr. McKenna, the Reverend began. We've received disturbing news from Missouri. Lenora felt the blood drain from her face. Garrett stepped protectively in front of her. Whatever you think you know, we know. One of the other men interrupted. That you're harboring a woman of loose morals. A woman who gave herself to a man outside of marriage and suffered the consequences. She murdered her own child, Mills added with vicious satisfaction. And now she's here, corrupting a good man, bringing her sin into our community. Get off my land. Garrett's voice was deadly quiet. Be reasonable, McKenna. Send her away. We'll help find you a proper wife, a clean woman who... The sentence ended in a gasp as Garrett's fist connected with the speaker's jaw. Chaos erupted, shouts, scuffles, dust rising as bodies collided. Lenora pressed against the cabin wall, watching in horror as Garrett fought all 4 men. Stop, she screamed. Please, stop. But it was the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked that froze everyone. Sarah Hutchins sat on horseback at the edge of the yard, her husband's hunting rifle trained on the group. Seems you gentlemen have overstayed your welcome, she said calmly. Best be moving along. The men gathered their dignity and their bruised companion. But Mills couldn't resist a parting shot. You'll be cast out, McKenna, both of you. No decent folk will have anything to do with... Then I guess we'll have to make do with the indecent folk, Garrett said, wiping blood from his split lip. Now get out. After they'd gone, Sarah dismounted and approached Lenora, who stood trembling on the porch. You all right, honey? How did you know to come? Saw them riding out this way, looking like a lynch mob. Figured you might need backup. She glanced at Garrett, who was testing what appeared to be a loosened tooth. Though seems your man had it handled. That night, Lenora made a decision. She couldn't let Garrett sacrifice everything for her. His standing in the community, his safety, his future. She waited until he fell asleep, exhausted from the day's violence. Then wrote a brief note. You deserve better than the grief I bring. Be happy. She slipped out into the darkness, taking only her carpet bag and the little money she'd saved. The moon was new, offering little light as she picked her way down the familiar trail. Tears blinded her, but she pressed on. This was the only gift she could give him, her absence. She made it perhaps 3 miles before the exhaustion and emotional toll caught up. A small lean-to used by hunters offered shelter, and she collapsed inside, shivering despite the warm night. Dawn was breaking when she woke to the sound of her name being called. Garrett's voice, hoarse and desperate, echoed off the mountains. He was looking for her. She pressed deeper into the shelter, but it was too late. His tall form appeared in the doorway, haggard with worry and lack of sleep. When he saw her, his face cycled through relief, anger, and something that looked like fear. Don't, he said roughly. Don't you dare run from me. I'm trying to protect you. I don't need protection. He dropped to his knees beside her, gripping her shoulders. I need you. Do you understand? I need you. But the town, your reputation, to hell with the town, to hell with all of them. His voice broke. When I woke up and you were gone. Lenora, I can't do that again. I can't lose someone else I love. You fought 4 men for me. I'd fight 40, 400. He cupped her face in his hands. Don't you understand yet? You're not my burden or my mistake. You're my salvation, the answer to prayers I didn't even know I was praying. I don't deserve. Neither do I. He interrupted. But here we are anyway. 2 people who've been through hell, finding grace in each other. If that's not worth fighting for, nothing is. She broke then, sobbing into his chest as he held her. He lifted her easily, carrying her back to his horse, back home. As they rode, he spoke quietly of his plans. They'd go to the territorial judge, make their marriage legal. They'd build something stronger than respectability. They'd build a life rooted in truth and choice and fierce love. And if they come back, she asked, then we'll face them, together. He pressed a kiss to her temple. No more running, Lenora, not from them, not from the past, not from each other. We make our stand here. The sun climbed higher, warming their faces as they rode home. Behind them lay the shelter where she'd tried to sacrifice herself for his sake. Ahead lay their cabin, their garden, their life together, complicated and difficult, but absolutely theirs. I love you, she said against his chest. I know, he replied. That's why you tried to leave. But love isn't about protecting someone from trouble. It's about facing trouble together. As they crested the last rise before home, Lenora felt something shift inside her chest. The shame wasn't gone, might never be entirely gone, but it no longer defined her. She was not the ruined girl from Missouri anymore. She was Lenora, soon to be McKenna, a woman who'd walked through fire and found love on the other side. And that, she thought as Garrett helped her down from the horse and into his arms, was worth fighting for. The wedding took place on a crystalline September morning in the smallest church Lenora had ever seen, a humble wooden structure that served the scattered homesteaders in the valley beyond Stillwater Creek. The ancient pastor, Reverend Thomas Hartwell, had traveled 2 days from the county seat after Sarah Hutchins sent word, "Don't mind that I'm near blind and older than Moses." He'd wheezed upon arrival. "I can still join folks in holy matrimony, and I don't ask questions that ain't my business." Lenora wore the new blue dress Garrett had insisted on buying, with wildflowers woven into her hair, Indian paintbrush for courage, lupine for happiness, and tiny white yarrow for healing. Sarah Hutchins stood as her witness, having arrived early to help her dress and calm her nerves. "You're shaking like a leaf," Sarah observed, adjusting Lenora's collar. "I never thought I'd have this," Lenora admitted. "A real wedding. Someone who wants to marry me knowing everything." Sarah's eyes softened. "That's the only kind of marriage worth having. Honey, the kind built on truth." Garrett waited at the altar in his one good suit, looking uncomfortable in the starched collar but radiating a quiet joy that transformed his weathered features. When Lenora entered the tiny church, his face lit with such naked adoration that her nervousness melted away. This was right. This was home. The ceremony was simple. No guests save Sarah and her husband Ben. No music except the wind through the pines outside. Reverend Hartwell's words were plain but heartfelt, speaking of love as a choice made daily, of marriage as a shelter built by 2 people against the storms of life. When Garrett slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, purchased with the sale of 2 calves, his hands were steady, but his voice shook as he made his vows. "I, Garrett James McKenna, take you, Lenora May, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow, in plenty and in want. I promise to cherish and protect you, to honor and sustain you, in all the trials and triumphs that lie ahead. This I swear before God and these witnesses, from this day until my last day." Lenora's tears flowed freely as she spoke her own vows, her voice growing stronger with each word. When Reverend Hartwell pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed her with a tenderness that held promises of all the years to come. They celebrated at the Hutchins Ranch with a meal of venison stew, fresh bread, and a cake Sarah had somehow managed to bake in secret. As the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold, Garrett and Lenora made their way home, truly home now, to the place that belonged to both of them. That night, in the bed they would share as husband and wife, they came together with a passion born of trust and survival, of choosing each other despite everything that had tried to keep them apart. In the darkness, skin against skin, they wrote new stories over old scars, claiming their future with every touch and whispered endearment. The weeks that followed brought an autumn of unusual beauty. The aspens turned gold early, creating rivers of light through the dark pines. Lenora threw herself into preparing for winter with new purpose. This was her home now, officially, legally, irrevocably. She canned vegetables from their garden, smoked meat alongside Garrett, patched and reinforced the cabin against the coming cold. One afternoon in early October, she sat at the kitchen table writing a letter. The words came slowly, but she was determined. Dear Mrs. Patterson, you don't know me, but I was once like your daughter. I was sent west as a mail-order bride after circumstances that seemed to end my life as I knew it. I write to tell you that there is hope beyond the shame, life beyond the condemnation of others. What are you writing? Garrett asked. Coming in from checking the cattle? A letter to a woman in Ohio. Sarah heard from the pastor that her daughter is in circumstances like mine were, being sent away. She looked up at him. I thought maybe I could help. Tell her it doesn't have to be the end. He crossed to stand behind her, reading over her shoulder. That's good. He said simply, that's real good, Lenora. It became her ministry of sorts. Word spread quietly, carefully, and letters began to arrive. From desperate mothers, frightened girls, women trapped in situations they couldn't escape. Lenora answered each one, offering practical advice about surviving in the territories. But more importantly, offering hope. Some she helped find positions as teachers or seamstresses. Others she counseled through their transitions to frontier wives. You're building quite a network, Garrett observed one evening, finding her surrounded by correspondence. Someone helped me once, she said, thinking of Sarah's kindness. Now I can help others. Winter arrived early that year, but they were ready. The cabin was snug, the root cellar full, enough wood split to last until spring. They weathered the storms together, no longer as two separate people sharing space, but as partners in the truest sense. One night in December, as snow fell softly outside, Lenora felt the first flutter of new life within her. She froze, hand pressed to her belly, afraid to hope, but the sensation came again, unmistakable, undeniable. Garrett, she whispered. He looked up from the harness he was mending. What is it? I think I'm with child. The harness fell from his hands. He crossed to her in 2 strides, kneeling before her chair. Are you sure? I felt it before, she said quietly. I know the signs. His hands covered hers on her belly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Are you afraid? She considered the question honestly. Yes, but not like before. This time I choose it. This time I'm not alone. Never alone. He swore, pressing his lips to her hands. Never again. The winter months passed in a haze of preparation and careful hope. Garrett carved a cradle with the same patient attention he'd once given to small wooden animals. Lenora sewed tiny clothes, each stitch a prayer for the future. Sarah Hutchins visited when weather permitted, sharing wisdom from her own 4 pregnancies. You're carrying well, she pronounced in February, eyeing Lenora's growing belly. Got that glow about you. But with the joy came shadows of fear. Sometimes Lenora woke in the night, gasping from dreams of blood and loss. Garrett would hold her, murmuring reassurances. But she could see his own terror in the tight lines around his eyes. They'd both lost children before. The possibility haunted them. One night in early March, as they lay listening to wolves howl in the distance, Lenora voiced what they'd both been thinking. If something happens, nothing will happen, Garrett interrupted. But if it does, promise me you won't let them take the baby. Whatever happens to me, promise, stop. He pulled her closer, his voice rough. You're both going to be fine. I won't let anything happen to either of you. She turned in his arms to face him. You couldn't stop what happened to Mary. He flinched as if slapped, but she pressed on. I'm not saying it to hurt you, but we can't pretend that wanting something enough makes it true. So I need you to promise, if I die but the baby lives, you won't die. His voice was fierce, desperate. Promise me. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I promise, but you have to promise too. Promise you'll fight. Promise you won't give up. I promise, she whispered. They sealed it with a kiss that tasted of tears and determination. Spring came slowly to the mountains, but by April the snow began its retreat. The garden plot emerged, dark and ready for planting. Lenora moved more slowly now, her belly round and heavy, but she insisted on helping where she could. You should rest, Garrett fretted, watching her plant the first row of beans. Moving helps, she assured him. The baby's restless today. I think it knows its time is coming soon. He paled at the words, and she reached for his hand. We're going to be all right, all three of us. That night, she felt the first twinges of labor. By dawn, the pains were regular and strong. Garrett rode hard for Sarah while Lenora paced the cabin, breathing through contractions that gripped her like iron bands. Sarah arrived with the sunrise, calm and competent. Men outside, she ordered Garrett, who looked ready to argue. This is women's work now. I'm not leaving her. Yes, you are. Lenora managed between pains. Please, I need to know you're close, but not watching. He kissed her fiercely, then allowed Ben Hutchins to lead him outside. The labor was long and hard. Hours passed in a blur of pain and effort. Lenora could hear Garrett pacing on the porch, wearing grooves in the wood. Once, when a particularly harsh contraction made her cry out, she heard something crash, probably his fist meeting the wall. Nearly there, Sarah encouraged as afternoon shadows grew long. You're doing so well. Just a little more. And then, between one breath and the next, everything changed. The final push. A searing moment of pressure. And then, a cry. Thin and reedy, but unmistakably alive. It's a girl, Sarah announced, cleaning the baby with practiced efficiency. A beautiful, perfect girl. Lenora sobbed as Sarah placed the infant on her chest. 10 perfect fingers, 10 perfect toes, a shock of dark hair like her father's, eyes that, when they fluttered open, were the deep blue of all newborns but might someday turn gray like storm clouds. Garrett, she called, her voice hoarse. Garrett! He burst through the door as if he'd been pressed against it, waiting. The sight of him, wild-eyed, hair standing on end, shirt untucked, made her laugh through her tears. Come meet your daughter. He approached slowly, as if in a dream. When he reached the bed, his legs seemed to give out, and he sank to his knees beside them. She's real, he whispered, one finger reaching out to stroke the baby's cheek. She's here and she's real. What will you call her? Sarah asked, cleaning up quietly. Lenora and Garrett looked at each other, a whole conversation in a glance. Hope, Lenora said softly. Hope Mary McKenna. Garrett made a sound that might have been a sob, burying his face against Lenora's shoulder. She felt his tears hot against her skin and knew they were tears of gratitude, of release, of promises kept and futures secured. As the sun set over the mountains, painting their small world in shades of gold and possibility, the little family huddled together in their bed. Hope nursed contentedly, making small sounds of satisfaction. Garrett couldn't seem to stop touching them both, a hand on the baby's back, lips pressed to Lenora's temple, as if assuring himself they were real. Thank you, he whispered into the gathering darkness. For what? For fighting, for staying, for this. He gestured to encompass all of it, the baby, the cabin, the life they'd built from the ashes of their separate griefs. "Thank you," she whispered back, "for saying, 'Come with me.'" Outside, the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky. Inside, a new family began its journey, bound together by choice and love and the fierce determination to claim joy from sorrow. The past would always be with them, their losses, their scars, but it no longer defined them. They were the McKennas of Montana territory now, Garrett, Lenora, and Hope. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The fire came in August, when Hope was 4 months old and the world seemed, at last, to have settled into a rhythm of contentment. Lenora saw the smoke first, a dark column rising from the eastern ridge like a warning finger pointed at the sky. "Garrett," she called from the porch where she'd been hanging washing. He emerged from the barn, took one look at the horizon, and his face went grim. "Lightning strike from last night's storm," he said. "Winds pushing it this way." Within hours, the entire eastern sky glowed orange. The smell of smoke grew thick, and ash began falling like gray snow. Garrett worked frantically to create a firebreak around the cabin, but Lenora could see the truth in his eyes. If the wind didn't shift, no amount of cleared ground would save them. "Take Hope to the Hutchins place," he ordered, pausing to wipe soot from his face. "Take the horse and go now. Not without you." "Lenora, no." She stood firm, the baby bound to her chest in a sling. "We stay together or we go together." He looked ready to argue, but a crash from the barn cut him short. The milk cow, terrified by the smoke, had broken through her stall. More crashes followed as the other animals panicked. "Help me get them out," he said, already running. Together they freed the livestock, the cow, the 2 horses, the handful of chickens. The animals fled westward, away from the advancing fire. Garrett caught their gentlest mare, throwing a blanket over her back. "At least ride to the creek," he pleaded. "Wait for me there. I just need to—" A sound like thunder made them both turn. The fire had crowned, leaping from treetop to treetop in a terrifying display of nature's power. It would be on them in minutes. "Now!" Garrett lifted her onto the mare, Hope still bound to her chest. "Go!" But he was running alongside, one hand on the horse's neck. They plunged into the creek just as the first flames reached their property. Lenora watched in horror as fire engulfed the barn, then raced toward the cabin. Their home, their haven, everything they'd built. "Don't look," Garrett said roughly, but she couldn't turn away. The creek provided some protection, but the heat was overwhelming. Garrett pulled them deeper, water to their waists, his body shielding her and Hope from the worst of it. Embers fell around them like fireflies from hell. One landed on the blanket covering the mare, and Garrett quickly doused it. Hope wailed, frightened by the smoke and chaos. Lenora sang to her, the same lullaby she'd hummed while pregnant, her voice shaking but determined. The baby quieted, finding comfort even in this nightmare. Time lost meaning in the orange twilight. The fire roared past, consuming everything in its path. At one point, Garrett pushed Lenora's head down, covering her and Hope as a wave of superheated air rolled over them. She felt him flinch, heard his sharp intake of breath, but he never loosened his protective embrace. Finally, eternally later, the fire moved on, leaving devastation in its wake. They emerged from the creek like survivors of a flood, soaked and shivering despite the heat, where their cabin had stood. Only the stone chimney remained, pointing at the sky like an accusation. The barn was gone. The chicken coop, the garden, the carefully stacked wood pile, all reduced to ash and char. The landscape looked alien. Trees turned to blackened stakes, the ground still smoking. "Oh, Garrett," Lenora whispered. His left arm hung awkwardly, and she saw the burns across his shoulder where embers had found him while he shielded them. But he was looking at her and Hope with such relief that their losses seemed to fade in importance. "You're safe," he said. "That's all that matters." They made their way carefully through the cooling devastation. The milk cow stood in the far pasture, lowing mournfully. One of the horses had returned, standing uncertainly at the edge of the burned area, small mercies in a landscape of loss. By evening, the Hutchins had found them. Sarah took one look at Garrett's burns and set about treating them with her usual competence. Ben surveyed the damage with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen his share of disasters. "You'll rebuild," he said simply. "We all will help." And they did. Word spread through the scattered mountain community, and people came. Not Reverend Mills or his followers, but others. Homesteaders who understood that fire was a shared enemy, that today's victim could be tomorrow's savior. They brought lumber salvaged from their own supplies, nails hoarded against future need, a window glass wrapped carefully in quilts. The women brought food and took turns minding Hope while Lenora worked alongside the men. Even strangers appeared. A group of miners who'd heard about the fire donated a day's labor, asking nothing in return. "Good folks help each other out here," one grizzled miner explained. "Ain't about who you were or where you came from. It's about who shows up when the devil comes calling." Garrett, his shoulder still healing, could only supervise, which frustrated him enormously. But Lenora saw how he watched the rising walls of their new home with something like wonder. This wasn't just reconstruction, it was transformation. The new cabin would be larger, with a proper bedroom for Hope and a bigger kitchen for Lenora's work. "Why are they doing this?" Lenora asked Sarah one evening as they watched the men raise the roof beams. "Some of them don't even know us." Sarah smiled. "You've been writing letters to their daughters, sisters, cousins. Word gets around. You helped them when they needed it. Now they're returning the favor." Lenora's eyes filled. Her letters, she'd thought them such a small thing. But here was the proof that kindness rippled outward like drops in still water. One day, as the cabin neared completion, a familiar figure appeared on horseback. Mrs. Mills, the Reverend's wife, approached hesitantly, a basket in her hands. "I brought bread," she said quietly, not meeting Lenora's eyes. "And some preserves." Lenora accepted the offerings, too surprised to speak. "I had a sister once." "Mrs. Mills continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She found herself in trouble. My father sent her away. I never saw her again." She finally looked up, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I should have stood up for her. I should have been braver." "It's not too late to be brave," Lenora said gently. "Mrs. Mills nodded, straightened her shoulders, and rode away. But she came back the next day, and the next, bringing other women with her, women who'd been silent before but now found courage in community. The new cabin was finished just as the first snows began to fall. It stood proud against the mountainside, smoke curling from a new chimney, windows glowing warm in the dusk. The fire had taken their past, Mary's embroidered towels, the rocking chair, all the physical memories of what had been. But in their place stood something new, built not just by their own hands, but by a community that had chosen to see them for who they were now, not who they'd been. That first night in the new house, they sat by the fire, a smaller one, contained and warming rather than destroying. Hope slept in her new cradle, the one piece Garrett had managed to save by storing it in the root cellar. "Do you miss it?" Lenora asked. "The old cabin?" Garrett considered. "I thought I would. Thought losing those reminders of Mary would feel like losing her all over again." He pulled Lenora closer. "But I reckon she'd understand. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. It just means making room for new memories alongside the old." A knock at the door interrupted them. Garrett opened it to find young Tom Henderson from town, hat in hand. "Sorry to bother you. Mr. McKenna, Mrs. McKenna, but there's a woman just came in on the stage. She's in a bad way. Folks are giving her trouble." "Someone mentioned Mrs. McKenna helps women like her. Could you come?" Lenora was already reaching for her shawl. This was her work now, her calling. She helped women who arrived broken and desperate, offered them what she'd needed most, acceptance, practical help, and hope. As they prepared to leave for town, Garrett caught her hand. "Proud of you," he said simply. She squeezed back. No words needed. They'd walked through literal fire together. Everything else seemed manageable by comparison. Later, returning home with the frightened young woman in tow, Lenora stood for a moment looking at their new cabin. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Windows still glowed with warmth. But now she saw it differently. Not just as their home, but as a beacon. A sign to other lost souls that redemption was possible. That lives could be rebuilt from ashes. That sometimes the very thing that destroyed you could forge you into something stronger. "Thank you for saying, 'Come with me,'" she whispered to Garrett as they helped the young woman inside. He smiled, that rare, transforming expression that still made her heart skip. "And thank you," he replied, "for staying." Inside, Hope began to cry, and Lenora went to tend her daughter. Outside, the mountains stood eternal, wearing their first crown of winter snow. The fire had scarred the land, but already, beneath the ash, seeds were settling in for spring. Life persisted, love endured, and in a cabin built by community and consecrated by survival, the McKenna family continued their story, not perfect, not without pain, but absolutely, irrevocably whole. Thank you all for listening to this story of love, redemption, and resilience in the Old West. Where are you tuning in from as you listen to this tale? I'd love to hear in the comments below. Let's connect across the miles. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts. These stories of the frontier remind us that even in our darkest moments, hope can bloom like wildflowers after a fire.